This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello there and welcome to Global Business Africa. We'll be giving you insight into Africa's business and financial markets. I'm Uche Okoronkwo, coming to you from Kenya's capital, Nairobi. Let's start with a look at the markets. Now, global markets rallied this week after U.S. President Donald Trump hinted at a smooth White House transition. We saw MSCI's emerging market equities index slipping after touching a near 34-month high earlier in the session. It, of course, was dragged down by China's blue chip index after news of a government investigation into the electric vehicle sector. Meanwhile, South Africa's JSE was little changed today as positive vaccine news and the market-friendly selection of Janet Yellen as U.S. Treasury Secretary boosted equity investor sentiment globally. In Nigeria, the market heavyweight boosted the all-share Dangote Cement. It climbed almost 3% today. Meanwhile, Dangote Sugar also followed suit, climbing about 5% on the day. Now, also coming up on today's show, China's participation in the G20 debt relief seen as a boost to multilateralism. And unemployment drops in Egypt as the country recovers from the COVID-19 downturn. And retail businesses in Uganda turn to technology to weather the COVID-19 storm. Well, we begin today's show with some sad breaking news from the world of sports. Argentinian football great Diego Armando Maradona has died of a heart attack. This comes just 2 weeks after he was released from hospital for treatment of a bleed in his brain. Now, life after football for the 60-year-old has been dogged with various health issues that saw him being operated on several occasions. Maradona helped Argentina to the 1986 FIFA World Cup, a tournament that is famous for his goal against England, which he scored with his hand. He was capped 91 times for Argentina and scored 34 goals. His club football saw him play for Argentinos Juniors, Boca Juniors in Argentina. He also laced up for Barcelona in Sevilla in Spain before becoming a cult hero in Naples in Italy for his performances for Napoli. After his playing days, he turned into a coach that culminated into guiding Argentina to the 2010 FIFA World Cup held in South Africa. But of course, a bad showing at the games saw him sacked. Now, Diego was the current manager of Argentine club Gimnasia de Plata. And let's move on to some business news now. The debt service suspension initiative has been deemed as a requirement for governments and creditors in order to help tackle Africa's solvency crisis. Now, German-based ratings agency Scope Ratings says that China's participation in the G20's debt service relief plan for vulnerable nations is central to multilateral efforts. The debt relief framework provides extra fiscal space in the near term to 29 participating African governments. Well, earlier I spoke to one of the authors of that report, Dennis Shen, and noted that of the 29 countries that are eligible for debt relief, only 4 have sought it so far. And I asked him why.
Well, the program does a significant amount when it comes to countries that have a liquidity crisis, but not necessarily enough for those that have an underlying solvency issue. And so for the former, for countries in which participation helps them meet and fulfill a short-term liquidity shortfall, the benefits are self-explanatory. However, for the latter cases, participation in DSSI, the Debt Service Suspension Initiative, could in fact compound medium-run debt crises. And so, if we look at countries in the latter case, for example, Angola, Djibouti, Mozambique, participation in the program, and as a result, the suspension of debt service from 2020, 2021 to a medium-term time horizon could increase the debt service, let's say over 2022 through 2024, by on average over 1% of GDP per year due to DSSI participation. And unfortunately, in addition, it is in many cases the borrowers that already had the more significant debt service coming due medium term to begin with that also see the more substantive increases in additional debt service payment demands. And so in other words, compounding the likelihood of sequential crisis in some of these cases for the borrowers that can least afford it. And so for certain cases, don't get me wrong, there are countries, for example, Burkina Faso, the Central African Republic, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, with low debt, low interest payments, for which participation in DSSI could be exactly the right remedy. But there are simply many other cases with more substantive debt sustainability challenges. Angola, Ghana, Burundi, in which the participation and misdiagnosis of crises as being more or less across the board liquidity in terms of really what the DSSI right now is trying to tackle, which as a result of participation could increase the likelihood of medium-run debt distress.
Quite right. Now, in the meantime, the G20 and the Paris Club, they've announced a new common framework for debt treatments beyond this DSSI initiative. They did it at this month's G20 summit. That has been criticized for its lack of transparency. Also, we're seeing none of these poor nations are included in these stocks. And of course, it isn't clear exactly how much support that new framework has from these nations so far. So what are your thoughts on this framework as a solution to addressing Africa's debt crisis?
The framework, the common framework, as announced by the G20 and the Paris Club, it's a positive step. It's a step in the right direction, but it doesn't do enough. And so the continued concentration on short-run nominal debt service savings and NPV haircuts do not go far enough. So if I understand the framework correctly, that even if a borrower were to demonstrate insolvency risk, that even in that case, the additional debt measures that could be made available could include longer-term debt maturity extensions, and or extensions of postponement of debt service on a nominal basis rather than on an NPV neutral basis. In other words, the postponement of debt service with repayment in full on a longer term time horizon. And as a result, an NPV haircut in future value terms. That's not enough in many cases. And as a result, the framework, it remains overly protective of creditors.
Well, let's now shift our focus to Egypt. The country's unemployment rate dropped to 7.3% in the third quarter of this year. That's down about 0.5% from the same period in 2019. Now, the country's state statistics agency said that unemployment had risen to 9.6% in the second quarter this year due to the economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. CGTN's Yasser Hakim has more details.
Another sign of recovery in the Egyptian economy. Experts attribute this quick rebound to the government's aggressive economic reforms in the last 4 years and the economic policies after the outbreak of the coronavirus in Egypt in mid-March.
The ongoing national projects that have been launched by the government and attracted international attention is the main cause. We have 180,000 acres in the new administrative capital, which is under construction. New bridges and roads are being built and upgraded and linking with the transport system. Also expanding in different sectors like fishing and agriculture that require a lot of workers. About 5 million skilled laborers have joined the workforce in this short time.
The sectors that have attracted the most jobs in the last quarter are real estate, infrastructure, and high-tech companies. One industry that is still suffering is tourism. Latest numbers show an 80% drop in hotel occupancy rates compared to last year. There are no statistics of the job losses in tourism after the pandemic, but before the pandemic, tourism had over 2 million workers, accounting for about 10% of the total workforce in Egypt. Ironically, the jobless rates in July to September this year are lower than 2019, when tourism and most sectors were performing well and economic growth had exceeded 5%.
Unemployment had reached 10% in previous years. Now it's at its lowest rate at 7.3%, which is a very good achievement, especially in the current circumstances with the coronavirus. It was based on orders by President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi to limit job losses during the pandemic. An example is that emergency funds were only provided to public and private sector entities that did not fire its workers.
According to statistics, rural areas have seen higher employments than urban areas. This could be linked to the multiple real estate and infrastructure work undertaken there, as well as the government-led mega project to cultivate 2 million acres of land around the country. Yes, Hakim for CGTN, Cairo.
Meanwhile, in Ghana, export trade has exceeded imports by $1.7 billion within the first 10 months of this year. That's according to the country's central bank. Now, this comes despite a downturn in the country's economy caused by the coronavirus pandemic. Economists are projecting revenue from the West African nation's exports will increase further by the end of this year. Here's CGTN's Nabil Ahmed Rufai reporting from Accra.
Ghana had already revised down its economic growth rate for the year from 6.8% to 2.5% due to the impact of COVID-19. But now, some good news as it tries to bring the economy back on track. Exports of the country's commodities and goods have significantly increased. The Bank of Ghana says export trade, which exceeded imports by $1.7 billion recorded within the first 10 months of this year, is bigger than what was achieved during the same period last year of $1.2 billion. The central bank says non-traditional exports such as handicrafts, processed or semi-processed agricultural products have contributed to the increase in revenue. Meanwhile, Ghana, which largely exports gold, also benefited when the price of the commodity reached an all-time high in July following the economic fallout of COVID-19. The country secured $5.72 billion from gold exports and $1.81 billion from cocoa exports, higher than what was recorded in the same period last year. Oil exports, however, dipped by about $1.4 billion to $2.4 billion in October 2020. Economists say the positive outlook of the country's export trade, which has exceeded imports, could improve the local currency as the economy gets more foreign currencies such as the dollar to shore up its reserves. Nabil Ahmed Rufai, CGTN, Accra, Ghana.
We're going to take a short break now, but still to come on the show. The African Union launches the Africa Mask Week as the continent experiences a second wave. And we look at the battle of local and imported fish in Western Kenya.
There is more to this place than just glorious landscapes. There's more to it than just, say, Table Mountain or glorious, endless salt flats. There's more to it than countries that are home to some of the deepest mines in the world. There is so much more to this place, even if it is home to some of the finest diamonds on the planet. It is the sheer diversity of the people who call Southern Africa home and the relentless drive to make it a better place that make it so special. And we know that because this too is home. No one knows Southern Africa like we do. CGTN, see the difference.
Welcome back. Now, the African Union has launched the Africa Mask Week. It is a campaign aimed at raising more awareness about wearing masks to stop the spread of COVID-19. The Africa CDC says the continent, which currently has over 1.4 million cases of the virus, is now experiencing a second wave of new infections, partly because people are more reluctant to implement public health measures. Here's Coletta Wanjohi reporting.
In Ethiopia's capital, Addis Ababa, mask wearing is becoming a norm for some people. At many such taxi pickup points, the drivers of taxis have taken it upon themselves to encourage people to observe COVID-19 regulations. But they say it is not easy.
Some of our people are not wearing masks, so we need the government to help on this.
We can't force people to follow guidelines. Maybe police should help us to enforce the restrictions.
As countries in Africa ease up restrictions on COVID-19 prevention measures, many citizens are also relaxing. The Africa Centers for Disease Control and Prevention says recent data shows in all parts of the continent, mask wearing is declining.
We are really beginning to be concerned that many countries are not enforcing the public health measures, including masking, which is extremely important. Wearing of masks appropriately and in a sustained manner is as effective as any vaccine that will come into the theater of response.
The public health body has launched Africa Mask Week. The campaign encourages individuals and organizations to post photos and speak out on the importance of wearing a mask. The African Union says wearing a mask is becoming the duty of every citizen.
We indeed are expected to fulfill that duty, all right, by wearing a mask, because that is an expression not only of a sense of responsibility and therefore a show of you caring for others, but also it is also a manifestation that you expect others to care for you as well.
According to the Africa CDC, more than 40 African countries have enacted policies on mandatory use of masks in public, but there are challenges with compliance to those policies. The Africa CDC says that mask wearing should be combined with physical distancing and hand washing for the COVID-19 preventive measures to be effective. The Africa Mask Week campaign is also challenging leaders to show a good example by consistently promoting mask wearing and by wearing a mask in public. Coletta Wanjohi, CGTN, Addis Ababa, Ethiopia.
Now, Nigeria's currency, the naira, has weakened to trade at about 6% lower than last week against the US dollar on its parallel market. This comes days after Nigeria's economy entered a recession for the second time in 5 years. CGTN's Phil Ihaza reports from Abuja.
The value of the naira to a dollar on the black market is trading at between 485 to 490. That's against the official rate of 379 naira to a dollar. The Central Bank of Nigeria pegged the official exchange rate at 379 naira to a dollar in August. Last month, the naira traded stronger at between 465 to 470 to a dollar on the black market, but worsened after the National Bureau of Statistics revealed at the weekend that the country had slipped into recession. Nigeria's economy has been struggling to fully recover since it emerged from the 2016 recession, and the outlook has now worsened because of the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and low crude oil prices on the global market. The country earns more dollars when it sells crude oil in that currency to other countries, but suffers from a low supply of dollars when prices of oil drop. The Minister for Finance, Zainab Ahmed, says the country will exit recession by the first quarter of 2021 as the government is working towards reversing the declining economic trend in the country. Phil Ihaza, CGTN, Abuja.
Meanwhile, South Africa's Finance Minister, Tito Mboweni, has once again publicly questioned the necessity of having a national airline. Now, the country is in its biggest financial crisis, and the move is seen as heightening concerns about divisions in its government. Here's Angelo Coppola taking up that story.
Mboweni asked his near 1 million followers whether the country needed a state-owned airline or whether a private company should be given the chance to fill the gap.
I thought his question on Twitter was an interesting one, coming after the fact of, after he's already signed off the allocation of the money for the airline and taken it away from other government services. And to me, it sent a big signal saying he's absolutely not convinced that he's done the right thing.
The finance minister is not shy about using his Twitter account to get his message across.
But he was quoted as saying that he wouldn't give 1 cent of his own money to SAA, and that if he had a chicken farm that he had to continually invest in and he got no eggs, he would close it down. So he's been very, very consistent.
One of the unions involved with the airline is less charitable about the finance minister's approach.
It's not the first time that the minister has raised questions about the viability of SAA. It's not the first time the minister has sort of lobbied the media directly or indirectly for support to collapse the airline, because that's been his goal as far as we're concerned.
But there appears to be a discrepancy between what the business rescue practitioners were commissioned to do and what the shareholder department wanted done. And this, an analyst says, could be behind the minister's tweets.
They gave a different set of numbers. They included bailout figures for 3 subsidiaries which were never included in the rescue plan. And they've suddenly watered down the amount of money associated with unflown ticket liabilities by a third, by R1 billion. So all of these things are, posing a lot of question marks. And I would imagine that the finance minister, who's under a lot of scrutiny, especially from potential investors and lenders and credit ratings agencies, is asking the same questions, because he probably just doesn't get the answers.
The airline staff that have been left behind are under pressure. They say the future remains unclear.
They don't know what the future holds. They've no idea if they've got jobs in January. They've got no idea if they're getting paid. And the government minister thinks it's okay to just tweet.
The bailout is a done deal, so the minister's social media activity is curious, to say the very least, because essentially this is out of his hands now when the new airline comes into being. I'm Angelo Coppola for CGTN in Johannesburg, South Africa.
Now, fish imported from China is gaining popularity in Western Kenya. The imported fish initially received resistance from its residents, but it's now being freely sold in markets around the lakeside city of Kisumu. CGTN's Daniel Arab Moy reports.
A box of imported fish from China here in Kenya's lakeside city of Kisumu. Demand for fish here is high and has mostly been offered by local fishermen. Their jobs are now threatened by the imports, but there is a catch. A box like this, containing 60 pieces of imported fish, goes for between $35 and $40. Compare that to local tilapia or Nile perch that goes for a premium $4 a piece.
The reason why people like fish from China, first, it's a bit cheap than the other one that's from lake. The second one, nowadays the lakes produce a small quantity of tilapia. So people are many, but the tilapia are few. So we are trying to get a large quantity, but we can't get from the lake. So we have to rush from the boxes, those who are seeing here, so that we can provide a large quantity of fish.
As a result, there has been significantly lower numbers of consumers going to the traditional fish market.
The number of people who buy fish from China at the moment, I can say it's high because most of the people who take fish, they take fish at the factory level and they just go. So if you see the turnout that is coming inside the market is low.
Overfishing on Lake Victoria has resulted into the depletion of many fish species, especially the tilapia, causing a deficit in supply.
The imported fish seems to be filling that gap, but local fishermen will not give up soon. Operational costs mean their product must be more expensive. However, they insist that their product is of higher quality and their customers do not mind paying the higher price. The beach management is also working to shore up stocks of local fish.
As the management, we are trying so that we cannot have this overfishing. Right now, when you look at the lake there, we have the new technology which is known as the fish caging farming. where now we reduce the overfishing inside the Lake Victoria. So the fishermen are now diverting from the fishing to the new technology.
In 2017, China's fish exports to Kenya rose to $11.4 million, higher than the $10 million registered in 2016. Daniel Arab Moi, CGTN, Kisumu, Kenya.
Now, the coronavirus pandemic has boosted the use of electronic equipment and materials in Tunisia. This is whether one is working remotely or e-learning. However, not everyone can access remote learning in the country, and to ensure that learning institutions are not left behind, Tunisian activists have launched an initiative called Sharek, which basically means share in Arabic. Now, the aim is to give a second life to used devices by distributing computers to pupils and students who need that equipment. Here's CGTN's Anan Shaushi reporting.
Mohamed Amin Ouni is the CEO of Trust IT, a Tunisian startup specializing in repairing electronic devices. Trust IT has created the first national network of trusted and approved repairers and technicians. The entrepreneur has launched the initiative Sharek to offer equal e-learning opportunities in Tunisia.
The initiative Sharek started during the first confinement in March, when the Ministry of Higher Education and the Ministry of Education opted for e-learning due to COVID-19. As a startup, we were already offering this service to our clients by fixing computers and electronic devices. The service was then upscaled when civil society activists and several organizations joined the project.
The successful project has attracted several sponsors as well as local and international partners. In partnership with the Ministry of Local Affairs, hundreds of students and pupils have already received the donations in 17 regions across the North African country.
Many international organizations have helped us, such as UNICEF and the Canada Fund for Local Initiatives, as well as several enterprises and individuals. We've reacted positively by donating equipment and electronic devices like used mobile phones, tablets, and computers. This wave of solidarity is facilitating learning for people who cannot afford to buy expensive equipment.
For this season, the collective Sharek and the company Tunisia Recyclage, specializing in waste recycling, have launched a campaign to collect electronic waste as part of a circular economy approach. The agreement provides for reducing the impact of the waste on the environment.
We repair all repairable devices. The first step is to check the computer's hardware, then we provide the software with the useful programs. If an electronic device isn't repairable, the technicians use it as spare parts for other computers to reduce electronic waste.
The founders of the Sharek Collective believe that by embarking on the recovery and repair of electronic equipment and components, they have added a fourth R, that of repair, to the principle of the 3 R's of the environment, namely reduce, recycle, and reuse. According to a recent study published by the Ministry of Education, 70% of primary school students and 51% of middle and high school students do not have computers or electronic devices to study online. The target of the initiative Sharek is to expand the collection and recovery of e-waste to ministries, hospitals, and public administrations. Adnan Shawishi, CGTN, Tunis.
You're watching Global Business Africa. We're going to take a short break now, but still coming up on the show. China hosts an annual gathering of 6 major international economic organizations. And the European Union braces for decisive Brexit talks in the coming days.
Taken me completely out of my depth, but at the same time it's exciting. It's new, it's different, it's a challenge.
It's really exciting.
I try to not let it affect me, but there are days when it does. I'm a human being, and to see patients in a hospital bed and their family members are not there, there's no one there to hold their hand, that human touch, you know?
I just hope everyone can remember that the situation is not permanent and that everything will get better eventually.
And here's a quick recap of other news headlines this hour. Argentinian football great Diego Armando Maradona has died of a heart attack. Now, this comes just 2 weeks after he was released from hospital for treatment of a bleed in his brain. Life after football for the 60-year-old had been dogged with various health issues that saw him operated on several occasions. And the international community has called for calm in Ethiopia, but the country's Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed says that he rejects what he described as outside interference. The UN Security Council has also held its first meeting about the 3-week-old conflict. A deadline set by the national government for fighters in the Tigray region to surrender expires today. And a military court in the Democratic Republic of Congo has sentenced a former Congolese rebel leader to life in prison for crimes against humanity. The court found Ntabo Ntaberi guilty of murder, rape, sexual slavery, and the recruitment of child soldiers. The crimes were committed in eastern DRC between 2010 and 2014. And finally, opposition candidates in Somalia have formed a joint council with elections around the corner. Pressure has been mounting on the government to make changes to regional and federal electoral committees. And that's a recap of today's top headlines. Well, let's get you some international news now. And heading to China, the 1.6 roundtable has concluded. Chinese Premier Li Keqiang virtually hosted the yearly gathering with the heads of 6 major international economic organizations, including the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. Now, the discussions on Tuesday focused on solutions to promote global economic recovery and growth in the post-COVID-19 era. Here's Feng Yilei reporting.
The world's second largest economy and its main global institutions are working towards the common goal of bringing the economy back to growth next year. The support and policies that China has come forward with have already had some effect, and that's given the international community some optimism.
China's development is deeply integrated into the world development. We will engage in greater opening up. China never deliberately goes after trade surpluses. We value both imports and exports. We want to achieve trade balance and sustainable development. Based on the statistics as we approach the end of this year, especially those on economic activity, we are fully confident that China's economy will achieve positive growth this year, and we expect it to return to the proper range next year. China's macroeconomic policies will remain stable, effective, and sustainable.
Leaders at the roundtable expressed appreciation for China's contributions in alleviating poverty, tackling climate change, and promoting trade and investment. And they are getting ready to widen cooperation as Beijing lays out blueprints for economic and social development for the next 5 years.
We need to work together to continue to assist the most vulnerable countries by providing debt relief and new financing. The extension of the G20 debt service suspension initiative and the new common framework for debt treatments are very welcome, and we appreciate China's efforts in helping to reach agreement on this initiative.
Premier Li Keqiang stressed that China will continue to take its responsibility as a developing country. and he underlined Beijing's support for world organizations as they lead the way in post-COVID global governance.
We talked about how to make the WTO better. The negotiating function needs to be improved. The dispute settlement function needs to be restored to a more effective and legitimate in the eyes of all system. We talked about the executive functions of the WTO and its proactive nature that's needed in a world that's rapidly changing. China has valuable experience to share in all of these areas.
Although world leaders have been warning that the recovery from this year's recession may be slow because of the COVID-19 resurgence, many have confidence that the cooperation between China and the rest of the world can help coordinate various macroeconomic policies to solve the crisis. And joint efforts to promote multilateralism and free trade will be conducive to the global economic recovery and growth. Feng Yilei, CGTN, Beijing.
Meanwhile, the head of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, says the coming days will be decisive as the bloc seeks to clinch a trade deal with Britain after its departure from the European Union. Now, she adds that major gaps could still lead to a rough split in trade with Britain past December 31st. She also says that the EU is prepared to be creative to find a solution.
The European Union is well prepared for a no-deal scenario. But of course, we prefer to have an agreement. I fully trust in the skillful steer of our chief negotiator, Michel Barnier. But one thing is clear. Whatever the outcome, there has to be, and there will be, a clear difference between being a full member of the Union and being just a valued partner. However, there are still three issues that can make the difference between a deal and no deal. The crucial topics for the European side are, of course, questions linked to the level playing field, the governance, and fisheries. And with very little time ahead of us, we will do all in our power to reach an agreement. We're ready to be creative, but we are not ready to put into question the integrity of the single market.
Now, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson says that the UK will not ask for more time to negotiate a post-Brexit trade deal, despite significant differences still remaining between the two parties. Now, Britain's government will pause pay rises for public sector workers, except those in the health service and on lower incomes. According to the country's finance minister, Rishi Sunak, the measure is a way to target those who need it most as the country deals with a slowing economy from the coronavirus pandemic. The country is also reducing assistance to poor nations.
This country has always and will always be open and outward-looking, leading in solving the world's toughest problems. But during a domestic fiscal emergency, when we need to prioritise our limited resources on jobs and public services, sticking rigidly to spending 0.7% of our national income on overseas aid is difficult to justify to the British people, especially when we're seeing the highest peacetime levels of borrowing on record. I have listened with great respect to those who have argued passionately to retain this target. But at a time of unprecedented crisis, government must make tough choices. I want to reassure the House that we will continue to protect the world's poorest, spending the equivalent of 0.5% of our national income on overseas aid in 2021, allocating £10 billion at this spending review. And our intention is to return to 0.7% when the fiscal situation allows.
In the meantime, passengers arriving in England will soon have their quarantine period reduced from 2 weeks to just 5 days. But that's only if they pay for a COVID test and it comes back negative. Now, the rules come into force in mid-December. Here's Andrew Wilson with more.
A visit to any UK airport makes immediately clear the desperate state of the travel industry and why the government wants to find ways to get some movement back into the system.
What we've got and announcing today is a system that will allow people, as you say, rather than to have to quarantine or self-isolate for 14 days, to do that with a test on day 5, and then as soon as you have a negative result, you'll be able to then leave quarantine or self-isolation, which will be, I think, a boost to the travel industry and obviously enable people to travel more.
There's an expense involved, between $100 and $150, but the government's hoping that'll come down with better test kits. Still, the measure is aimed at holidaymakers and business travellers alike.
This measure is not going to be for everyone. There are some people who will find it easy to quarantine for 5 days on their return, but many people can't, and they also may not be able to afford it, especially if they're a family of 4. It could cost hundreds of pounds for them to get a private test after 5 days.
But we are seeing those costs coming down very quickly. And if we can use the lateral flow tests that are being used in places like Liverpool, then of course those are very quick and very cheap. And if that's part of the solution, then actually this could be something that anybody could use to get closer to business as usual.
The measures start on the 15th of December and only in England. Other devolved UK governments are holding back for now. The logistics are far from simple. Tests can take time. Passengers will still need to find a place to isolate and eventually organise their tests. But a step in the right direction is the conclusion of many.
It's going to mean that our guests will be able to travel out. Many have indicated that a short quarantine they'd be able to cope with, whereas 14 days they can't. We're hoping that the lack of bookings we've had since the summer is going to turn around in the next few days.
The airlines are still pushing for something more radical, a pre-departure testing regime or immediate arrival checks that would avoid quarantine altogether. There's light at the end of the tunnel, they say, but it's still some distance away. Andrew Wilson, CGTN.
Now, German Chancellor Angela Merkel is to meet leaders of the country's federal states to decide whether Germany will remain on lockdown. Draft plans have been released ahead of the meeting on managing that pandemic through the winter as the health system faces continuing strain. In Frankfurt, Trent Murray now has those details.
The leaders of Germany's 16 states will meet with Chancellor Angela Merkel for a high-stakes summit that will decide whether Germany and its 83 million citizens remain under lockdown. A partial lockdown has been in place here since the start of November. It was only meant to last a month, a so-called circuit breaker to try and slow the spread of COVID-19. But the infection rate isn't falling fast enough, and so state leaders have come up with new draft plans to take to the Chancellor. It looks like the current restrictions will be extended for an additional 3 weeks. It means hotels, restaurants and gyms will remain closed and people told to stay at home as much as possible. Domestic travel for tourism is also prohibited. Private gatherings will be limited to just 2 households with a maximum of only 5 people. Children under 14 won't be counted in the limit of 5, rejecting an earlier suggestion by the Chancellor for children to choose one playmate to see over the winter holidays, something the states roundly pushed back against. Masks are mandatory in public buildings, stores and on public transport, and their use could be further extended to schools that sit within COVID-19 hotspots. For areas where the incident rate is high, more high school students will have to wear face coverings in the classroom during their lessons. But for Christmas, there may be some reprieve. Gatherings involving people from more than 2 households will likely be allowed, with the limit increasing from a maximum of 5 to 10. But for those who do get together, the government looks set to ask them to then self-isolate after Christmas to help reduce the risk of the holiday becoming a super spreader event. The proposals come as Germany's economy grew by a better than expected 8.5% in the third quarter, according to the latest revised data. The increase in gross domestic product beat the preliminary estimate of 8.2% quarter on quarter, which was announced in October. But the numbers cover the period just before the second lockdown, meaning economists expect the figures to fall once again for Q4. New lockdown measures can only be enforced if and when all the states agree to sign up to them. Chancellor Merkel doesn't have the authority to enforce measures across the whole country. That's been one of the main issues of contention between her and regional leaders throughout much of the pandemic, meaning if the infection rate starts to drop in certain states, they may well push to exit the lockdown agreement earlier than others. Trent Murray, CGTN, Frankfurt.
Now, many Americans are heeding medical advice to hold modest Thanksgiving gatherings as the coronavirus pandemic rages on. That means they're gobbling up smaller turkeys, and that's left the poultry industry in the country with a shortage of smaller birds and a surplus of the bigger ones, traditionally in demand. Liling Tang reports.
In any normal year, this 30-odd pound turkey would be highly sought after as America's favorite centerpiece for Thanksgiving dinner. But not this year.
Nobody's looking for a nice big turkey for a large family gathering.
Ronnie Lee owns Lee Turkey Farm in East Windsor, New Jersey. He raises about 2,500 turkeys every year and usually sells out almost all 700 of his bigger birds ahead of Thanksgiving to his retail customers. This year, however, he's running out of smaller birds.
Those restrictions of how many you're allowed to gather together has greatly affected them and us, because now the people that would normally get 30-pound turkeys are looking for 15 and 16-pound turkeys.
A recent survey conducted by the American turkey and poultry company Butterball found that 3 out of 4 of its respondents are opting for simpler, smaller Thanksgiving dinners this year, which is in line with recommendations from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Because so many Americans are planning smaller Thanksgiving gatherings this year, demand has surged for smaller birds like these behind me, about 20 pounds or less. And that creates a problem for farmers who now find themselves with a surplus of bigger birds. It's a problem for America's turkey industry, where about 40 million turkeys are usually consumed every Thanksgiving.
Happy Thanksgiving.
That's because much of the farmers' planning, egg ordering and hatching of turkeys for the holidays, especially for frozen turkeys, happens in advance early in the year.
Most of the frozen birds that you might buy in the supermarket, those turkeys went into the field before the pandemic hit. To the extent that there's been adjustments, it would be in the fresh turkeys that you see in the supermarket. Those went in the field more recently. Those are being harvested, beginning in the early fall, on right up through the holiday.
Lee Turkey Farm deals in both fresh and frozen turkeys and managed to process some of their smaller birds earlier. But lower demand and cancellations means these bigger birds, once destined as Thanksgiving dinner centerpieces, will be processed into pots or donated to charity.
What we're stuck with that I see that's going to be difficult is an extra 250 turkeys that are in a 30-pound range.
And for a sector already hit hard by restaurant and food service closures, rising COVID-19 cases has the industry also bracing for smaller turkey dinners come Christmas. Liling Tan, CGTN, New Jersey.
Well, let's now shift focus and take a look at commodity markets. Oil prices rising for a fourth straight session today. They extended a rally which has been driven by hopes that a COVID-19 vaccine will boost fuel demand. Now, the market also shrugged off an industry report that showed U.S. crude stockpiles rose more than expected. Meanwhile, gold languished near a 4-month low today as the market turned toward riskier assets. Traders are saying that trading in gold is moving into a new phase as vaccine developments improve the growth outlook and slowly end the pandemic caused disruptions that, of course, gold markets have been pricing in. Let's head into a short break now, still coming up. Retail businesses in Uganda turn to technology to weather the COVID-19 storm.
The greatest journeys, the greatest sights, the greatest adventures.
Here in Panata, this weir allows the locals to walk on water.
We're far more than just TV news. We're your passport to the wonders of Africa.
To bring you stories of struggle, survival and hope.
So let's explore. CGTN. See the difference.
Now, the COVID-19 pandemic is changing the way businesses operate in Uganda. A recent retail trade report by Uganda's Innovation Village, an organization of entrepreneurs, shows that businesses in the country are embracing online platforms to reach their consumers. Several businesses closed shop at the start of the pandemic in March, but even as the country begins to open up now, many are still struggling to stay afloat. As CGTN's Michael Baleke now reports.
A virtual diagnosis. Rhoda Mubiri is consulting her doctor over the internet. She previously had to show up physically to the medical facility.
It has made my work very easy in this COVID situation. And I love the fact that they are bringing services to us at home.
Using voice, video or chat, patients like Rhoda can book a vaccination, go to an online laboratory and also get drug prescriptions from an online pharmacy. E-commerce shop Rocket Health says they have registered an increase in visitors from about 150 per day before the start of the pandemic to over 800 to date. This is attributed to the increase in demand for telemedicine during the lockdown and curfew, but also where going into a physical clinic may put patients at risk of COVID-19.
As a business, we don't have as much high administrative costs, and we're able to save in pricing and make it more affordable for a lot of consumers. We've seen up to 50% cost savings with some of our medical insurance partners, so they're also loving this, and that's also eventually going to help reduce the premium for healthcare insurance.
The online food business is also picking up. The pandemic has forced through a revolution of in-app triggered food delivery. Ugandans are going online to buy fresh market produce or cooked food from restaurants.
We see that the online delivery has been a lifesaver for these businesses, for these small restaurants. So customers buying online have helped the restaurants stay open, have helped jobs to stay alive, because without delivery, without Jumia food, without online platforms, many restaurants would be closed today.
This shift online, according to a recent retail trade report by Uganda's Innovation Village, is largely driven by the rise in access to the internet, smartphone adoption, and a young adventurous population. Previously, people had to beat this kind of traffic to sit in waiting rooms or at a lab waiting for results. However, mobile phone technologies are helping them save a lot of time. But business experts say the challenge now is how to make the online transactions a lot cheaper. And several businesses are moving to tailor their products to fit the current economic situation.
Many people have lost their jobs. For those who have their jobs, the earning potential has reduced. So the pricing today you find on Jumia Food is designed with that in mind, to make sure that we give our consumers the best prices possible. The restaurants have come together, they've reduced their menu prices, they are giving incredible deals, some of them buy one, get one free, some of them up to 50% off.
And this is helping businesses drive up sales. But experts on technology say for businesses to remain sustainable online, more people need to be trained.
We need to skill as many youth as possible, equip them with the necessary digital skills and tools that they'll need to be competitive moving forward.
The use of such alternative technologies are not only providing tangible value to consumers, but also opening up opportunities for the future of retail enterprises that have been slow on business during the pandemic. Michael Baleke, CGTN, Kampala, Uganda.
And Tanzania's nightclubs and bars are proving to be fertile ground for a growing number of live stand-up comedians, some of who say they now have global aspirations. Live comedy's growing popularity in Dar es Salaam especially has led to an explosion of performers over the past few years, as CGTN's Daniel Kijo now reports.
Maxwell Machange swapped a life in the bush as a tour guide to cracking ribs as a stand-up comedian in Tanzania's cities. He says perceptions that comedy isn't a serious career are gradually changing, and his career switch is paying off.
You don't have to be weirdly dressed to do comedy. You can look smart but still be a comedian. And a stand-up comedian has to be someone who studies a lot, reads materials, is updated on trends. Not just a comedian, we read and study. We watch the news and are updated. It's an intellectual thing too.
The stand-up comedy scene has grown significantly over the last 3 years. 5 years ago, there was just one well-known comedian, Evans Bukuku. But now, Dar es Salaam alone boasts about 100. Maxwell has his own regular gig called the Night of Laughter, but is also part of an ensemble called Watubaki. And the 10-member crew is now taking Dar es Salaam by storm despite the challenges.
We're in the investment phase where you put in a lot and you don't really see much in return because we have to grow the market. It's always about the market. Who can buy? Who's watching you, you know? So if you cannot, you might have a good idea, you know, you might be doing good things, but if there is no market for that, you're not going to expect sponsors and stuff because at the end of the day, it's business.
Tanzanian comedy pioneers like Evans Bukuku from Punchline, Koi Mzungu from Cheka 2 and others have inspired a recent wave of upcoming comedians. Christina Rogat is proud to be one of a handful of female comedians.
It's because most are afraid of being embarrassed. They think they won't be funny. Maybe men would find me weird. They should stop being scared and just try. This stuff is beneficial and really nice.
Along with a live event, Watubaki has partnered with TV stations and other platforms in a bid to grow, and they're hoping the industry will only grow in strength. As stand-up comedy continues to see a steady rise in Tanzania, many comedians in the country have an eye to reach a bigger audience. Platforms like this are trying to pave the way for raw talents to expand first into East Africa and then to the rest of the world. Daniel Kijo, CGTN, Dar es Salaam.
And before we leave you today, here's a quick look at Africa's currencies. South Africa's rand shrugging off last week's credit rating news. That was just about as bad as it comes. The currency is instead responding to positive global news, edging higher after data showed consumer prices rose faster than expected in October. Now, all these positive developments globally have put the volatile rand on a course for an almost 7% rise this week versus the dollar. Meanwhile, Nigeria's naira weakened against the dollar on the official market as forex turnover drops. It remained somewhat stable against the dollar at the parallel market, closing at around 480 naira per dollar. That is as the state warns that forex speculators against forcefully pushing for the devaluation of the naira to aid their illegal activities. Well, that is it for this edition of Global Business Africa. Remember, you can send your feedback to the contacts on your screen. You can also follow us on our various digital media platforms. From me, Uche Okoronkwo, and the rest of the team, thanks for watching.